Hello YouTube, Chrisiousity here. So way back when I was first on YouTube, okay, wasn't all that long ago. Anyway, I did a whole series on Gad Saad, rebutting his speech to college students about freedom of expression and political correctness. Now, people who have seen it will remember that in part 3 of the series, I got to a part where I was just amazed at how not true the statements he made were about several subjects, but most especially about a particular situation regarding Laura Kipnis, who was a professor who had a Title IX charge levied against her. I was so floored at just how completely wrong about it he was. I mean, he's a college professor, a scientist who's written books and done studies, so he should know how to do basic looking stuff up on the internet. And people came to me after and mentioned that he had done this not only at this speech, but also in chats with Christina Hoff Sommers, for example, where they sat around saying not true things on this subject, and it seemed to be making the rounds of right-wing YouTube with various degrees of untruthery. So yes, I was puzzled, but having already talked about it, I wasn't really interested in debunking it again. Until the YouTuber Angry Bastards came out with his video on the American GOP funding and financial connections of many of our favorite little right-wing YouTubers. So it gets a bit complicated, but this is how we're going to proceed. First, I will replay the section of the Gad Saad video where I talk about Laura Kipnis, for those who've not seen it. I will add a timestamp for those who have, but if you haven't, definitely watch, otherwise this won't make a lot of sense. I will then put in the parts of the chat with Christina Hoff Sommers where they talk about it and some bits of an interview with Laura Kipnis by Reason TV. Once we are all on the same page, I will show, with permission, the Angry Bastards video. It is short, and we will tease out the money piece of it, and we will wrap it up from there. But it is important to note that what I'm doing here is not just about Laura Kipnis, or Gad Saad, or Christina Hoff Sommers. This is a bigger issue about social media, and whether or not these platforms are being twisted or even co-opted by big money interests, and what that means for us in our little marketplace of ideas.
Here's another incredible example. Laura Kipnis. Does anybody know that case? Only a fewer. Okay. Laura Kipnis is a professor of, I think, film studies and media at Northwestern University. And again, notice that these are all very elite universities. It's not as though this type of atmosphere is something that is reserved for some outlier quack schools, right? These are, the hotbeds of intellectual thought, certainly in the United States, and of course, in many cases in Canada. So she wrote an article where she was rebutting this idea that, women are being raped all over campus. And by the way, she's an ardent feminist, right? She's a woman. She's an ardent feminist, so she holds all of the correct identity politic chips on her side. She wrote an article where she was trying to put in context that, maybe we need to sort of get a bit of a grip, that it's simply not true that there's this massive, gang rapes going on everywhere, right? Well, students filed a Title IX charge. Title IX is a federal statute or act that basically says that you cannot deny access to education for people based on their race and ethnicity and gender and so on. And the fact that she had written an article as an academic to rebut their position was threatening to them. So her expressing an alternate position was threatening. They would feel unsafe, and hence they wouldn't be able, and future students wouldn't be able to safely attend this university because of the position that she had taken. So to argue against somebody else's position becomes a form of assault that should be punished. Not good.
All right, so there are not two ways to talk about this. This was just not true. It's just false. Everything that you say about it is wrong. What the article was about, why it was written, what the students were angry about, and why the Title IX was filed. That's all incorrect. All right, so let's talk about this article. This article was not about how many sexual assaults were taking place on campuses and that they aren't as frequent as people think they are or as feminists want you to believe. In fact, she doesn't mention anywhere in the article how widespread assault is. That's not what this is about. Her article was about the right of students and professors to have sexual relationships with each other. So, allow me to read from this article since apparently you didn't read it yourself. When I was in college, hooking up with professors was more or less part of the curriculum. Well, that must have made for an interesting syllabus. She also talks about drinking and partying and getting high and sleeping around with her professors. And if you're wondering if she slept with any of her own students, yes, she has. Though she says she doesn't much want to anymore, whatever that means. She does get all excited, though, when she talks about how an assistant professor was flirting with her, even though she was, quote unquote, an aging biological female. So, yeah, so it was a great read. Wonderful. That I have done for you, Professor. Did this for you. You should have done your own research, but instead I had to do it. Now you may ask yourself, why did Northwestern change the rules? I'll just read from an article about the incident that appeared in Vox. Why Northwestern Investigated a Professor for Writing an Essay About Sexual Panic by Libby Nelson. Kipnis's first essay was provocative, but students didn't file a formal complaint because she defended professor-student relationships in general. Their objection was to a few paragraphs in the middle of the article where she described and drew conclusions from a tumultuous case at her own university. In 2014, an undergraduate sued Northwestern, saying Peter Ludlow, a philosophy professor, got her drunk while she was underage, forced her to come home with him, and then groped her while she slept. The professor claimed the student insisted on coming home with him and then made sexual advances. The student argued that the university didn't take appropriate action after she reported the assault, which led to PTSD and a suicide attempt. After the undergraduate filed her lawsuit, it became known that a graduate student in philosophy had also accused Ludlow of sexually assaulting her. The graduate student had, with help from another faculty member, previously filed a Title IX complaint against him, accusing him of non-consensual sex. Now, I'll summarize this part because otherwise I just have to read the whole article plus the one in Huffington Post, both of which I will link. The complainants against Miss Kipnis state that the professor made some errors when she discussed these particular events in her essay, which she eventually cops to, but they say that when they contacted her about this originally, she ignored them, at which point they filed a Title IX. Back to quoting. Title IX also forbids retaliation against people who report sexual assault, including subjecting them to adverse action, treatment, or conditions. So the students were concerned about this being written as an act of retaliation, and they're concerned that, if you have to be afraid that if you come forward with a complaint, that one of your professors from the school that you're complaining about is going to take it upon herself to write an article that spreads misinformation about you and your complaint, accuses you of being melodramatic, strongly implies that your sexual harassment was not bona fide, quote unquote. Of course that's going to make you not want to come forward. Of course that's going to be in your head. It's just crazy to me. You're wondering why I'm so annoyed. Not only, Professor, did you make this video the sad truth, I'm guessing that was ironic, but you doubled down on this. You had that guy who does the cartoon stuff, or the drawing stuff, I guess, and he sketched this out and he made a whole picture of it, and that's a separate whole video that's on your sad truth. It fit your narrative, so you never bothered to check, or even worse, you did check and you didn't care. This is plainly unacceptable, and I don't know how else to say it. Moving right along. Miss Kipnis eventually had to answer some tough questions, which ended up with no findings. And she wrote a follow-up essay about the whole Title IX process. Mr. Ludlow was found guilty of sexual harassment, but not assault. He sued the young women and the school, and this lawsuit was dismissed.
Would you put Laura Kipnis as part of that crowd, given what she went?
Yes, Laura Kipnis is a great example.
Yeah, okay, good.
At Northwestern, where she's very much a feminist, and she found the idea of trigger warnings absurd and wrote a paper in the Chronicle of Higher Education, sort of making fun of it. 2 graduate students, what vindictive graduate students.
Yeah.
Where did this come from? People that are so angry and mean and want to hurt people. They said that they were triggered by her article, and they brought her up on Title IX charges.
And I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, that by her questioning the narrative of sort of the endemic campus rape culture, that was creating an unsafe environment for future generations. Hence, these women in the future would not have equal access to education. Hence, the Title IX being operative,
yes.
right?
Her article, they claimed, would violated Title IX, which
Incredible.
should have protected them from that kind of harassment. Well, it was complete nonsense. Now, they can bring up any charge they want. You would not expect the university
to move forward, yeah.
her. And it took several months. And she describes this Kafkaesque ordeal, having to explain what she wrote. Well, eventually they let her off. And then some people's apologists said, oh, well, the system worked. She was exonerated. No, the system did not work.
She's been punished by the virtue of the process.
Okay, so this is interesting. First, note that being told he was wrong about the things he said did not cause Professor Saad to go back and make any corrections or apologies, and certainly not to check into it any further. This should strike you as a bit odd, given his scientific background and professed hatred of people misrepresenting other people, but there you go. What's interesting here is that whereas the things Saad was saying were just wrong, literally the only time Laura Kipnis talks about the rates of rape on campus is in an aside where she says if colleges really wanted to fix this issue, they would shut down all the fraternity houses, which is hardly in keeping with the story he was spinning. But on the other hand, she does bring up trigger warnings. She doesn't talk a lot about them or have really strong opinions, but she talks about them. Now, for myself, I have trouble believing that Miss Sommers would know that trigger warnings were mentioned and know about the article that Kipnis wrote about Title IX, but doesn't know what the article was actually about or what the charges were actually about. It does occur to me that anyone who had read Kipnis's article or decided to read it in the future will now, instead of immediately knowing that something's very wrong, now they might actually think, well, she got a Title IX over that little bit about the trigger warning? And just go on with there. All right, so now I'm just going to post some bits of the interview with Reason TV so you can hear Kipnis herself tell you what happened and also notice the way it is framed by the interviewer. By the way, I'll be linking all of these things.
Laura Kipnis, thank you for joining Reason TV.
Hi.
We will talk about your book in a second, but let's first talk about your perhaps unlikely new role as poster child of the anti-campus political correctness movement. Earlier this year, you write an essay about sexual paranoia in academia for Chronicles of Higher Education, in which you criticize the sort of administrative changes, regulatory, and even social changes at the University at Northwestern as regards sexual assault and just sexism in general. And then the reaction goes bananas. There are protests, and eventually even 2 students filed a Title IX complaint against the words that you wrote, yes, saying that it was somehow going to stifle a chilling effect on their lives here. When this all happened, the reaction, did you at least have a chance to pause and high-five yourself for having your theory proved correct, or did it go straight to the Kafkaesque nightmare?
Well, I should go back a bit and say that I was writing in this article as a feminist, and I was writing with some concern about what now gets labeled feminism on campuses, which has to do with, I think, dialing back a lot of progress women in particular have made about establishing ourselves as consenting adults. So a lot of the impetus of these new campus codes is to take consent away from women and students and put it in the hands of administrators. So I was, writing against this wave of new regulation, particularly the codes governing professors and students dating. So what happened then was students staged this protest carrying mattresses and pillows and carrying a petition to the president's office. But the whole thing is that the mattress had become a symbol at Columbia, as everyone knows, having to do with student-on-student sexual assault. And I had written nothing on that subject. So
Okay, so she tells you what the article was and was not about. So right away you can see what I'm referencing. By the way, I should make the point here that my concern is not with Ms. Kipnis's opinions about professor-student relationships. She's certainly entitled to have opinions about that and write about that. I do care about consent in any sexual relationship, of course, and things like sexual harassment and power dynamics are very much worth discussing, just outside the purview of this video.
Talk about a little bit about what you described as the inquisition that happened afterwards. A Title IX investigation that sounds like gobbledygook for those of us who haven't been on a college campus really for 25 years. They haul you in, you don't have access to a lawyer, but you can have a support person. Is that like a support animal or something? What happens there? Talk us through the due process of what happened to you next.
Well, I had written a couple of paragraphs in the first article about this situation that was going on our campus about a professor who had been accused of sexual misconduct with two students. And I made brief reference, there were two cases, there was one of an undergrad and one of a graduate student, and I had made very brief reference to the graduate student's case, like by brief I mean 7 or 8 words. So when I found out, I got this letter from the Title IX office that complaints had been filed against me, under Title IX, and I, like everyone else, thought, well, doesn't this have to do with like gender discrimination or sexual harassment? I wasn't that familiar with it, and I didn't see how it could apply to an article. And I was being charged with retaliation, and I didn't see how I could be charged with retaliation if I hadn't committed some sexual misconduct against somebody in the first place that I'd been charged with. So the whole thing was very baffling. And in many ways, it is still baffling. It's one of the things I want to do is learn more about Title IX. So this emanates from the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights, and all campuses that get any kind of federal funding have to stay in compliance with Title IX regulations, which are very vague, or they risk losing federal funding. So of course, Northwestern is in the position, if anybody files a complaint, to jump into gear and pursue this investigation.
This is another important aspect of counteracting some of the things that Christina Hoff Sommers said, in that when a Title IX is filed, it has to be investigated in accordance with law. The school doesn't get to pick and choose or decide if something is worthy of investigating or not. And of course, Ms. Sommers probably ought to know that. Anyway, so this next part I'm putting in just because it is my new favorite excuse for saying not true things ever.
The university brought in 2 outside investigators from a firm in another Midwestern city, flew them in to conduct this investigation that went on for 72 days over essentially 7 words in this article.
Wow.
Yep, that's right, because that's how we measure a lie, by a word count. So for instance, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction is only 6 words, so it's even less of a big deal. Good to know. Okay, now for the money bit. I did add a couple of notes to the original Angry Basterds video, and there was one bit where I overdubbed my own voice where Matt stumbles over some words just for the sake of clarity. But that is just direct reading. It's not something I changed.
Let me tell you some interesting information on who's funding and backing the YouTube jackasses of the right wing. First, let's start off with Prager University, which is run by Dennis Prager. Dennis Prager is funded by FIRE. FIRE also funds Gad Saad.
Foundation of Individual Rights and Education, the acronym is FIRE, directed by a good friend of mine, Greg Lukianoff.
Investigated,
Yeah.
and this is happening. If you check out the organization FIRE, the Foundation
Oh
for
yeah.
Rights and Education.
You mentioned FIRE. I actually had Greg Lukianoff on the show. Absolutely fantastic guy doing God's work if you believe in God. So yeah, he's a wonderful organization. People should support it. They're really standing at the forefront of trying to protect First Amendment rights.
which are both funded by the Cato Institute, which is also partnered with the relationship between the Cato Institute and the Ayn Rand Institute. The Ayn Rand Institute is also funded by American Enterprise Institute, which also funds Christina Hoff Sommers, which these are all funded vertically and inadvertently by Dick Cheney. And most of it must come from CIA-backed money from his 20th century years in office. The Heritage Foundation, which funds also Christina Hoff Sommers, which are both funded by the Koch brothers and the GOP. Moving on yet again. Alex Jones and Paul Joseph Watson on InfoWars, which is owned by America's Talk.
America's Talk was one of 11 channels produced by iHeartRadio Inc., which is owned by Bain Capital,
which has Mitt Romney as a board member.
Additionally, Reason TV is part of the Reason Foundation, which, as you can see, is linked to the Koch brothers, Cato Institute, ExxonMobil, and the think tank the Fraser Institute, also a beneficiary of the Koch Foundation money, and where one Ezra Levant used to work. Ezra, who had ties to the Koch Foundations even before working there, has been a lobbyist for tobacco and oil interests, and now leads the Rebel Media. So now we are all well equipped to play 6 degrees of the Koch brothers or 6 degrees of the GOP with so many of our right-wing YouTube channels. Only it's a really boring game, since no one ever seems to be more than 2 to 3 degrees of separation away. For that matter, they don't seem to be more than 2 to 3 degrees of separation away from each other. So what is the point? I mean, I can just read the comments now that just because you're funded by super right-wing American interests doesn't mean that everything you say is wrong, right? The point is to be skeptical, to ask questions and use your critical thinking skills. If people are telling you things and those people are being funded by groups which benefit from what they are telling you, that's something you should take note of. If you can then demonstrate that those same people have a loose relationship with the truth, such as we saw with Gad Saad or Christina Hoff Sommers, the factual feminist, ironically named, of course, or people like Ezra Levant, who's been sued for libel successfully more than once, then you should really start doubting the stuff they say. Just like if a scientist who's being paid by Philip Morris tells you cigarettes are just fine for your health, or things like that, file it under things that make you go, and then do your due diligence. Go ahead and read the article yourself that they reference. Read the studies they list. Ask questions and pay attention to that little voice in your head that says, something seems off here. When I started working on the Gad Saad series that I did, I didn't have any clue about who he was buddies with, but I did know that his arguments were very odd for a scientist and a professor. Usually those aren't the kind of people who throw out some buzzwords and anecdotes, reference a couple weak sources, and then start making giant leaps of logic. It didn't make sense to me, so I checked. This is not to say, oh, how brilliant am I, because one, there have been plenty of times, I'm sure, that I've fallen prey to bias or laziness or what have you. And two, without the work of the Angry Bastards, I wouldn't have gotten past the point of, well, he says untrue things for reasons I can't figure out. How odd. The conservative movement in America is very rich and very powerful, and right now they're probably also very worried. Everything from the Occupy protests of a few years back to the unprecedented popularity of Bernie Sanders, What with his talk of democratic socialism. In America, that is a dirty word. Believe me. Then you have the new environmental treaties, so they have problems. The millennial generation is very progressive, and they want to change that, or at least get in its way. So while it's hard to argue their position directly, wealth being concentrated in the hands of a very few individuals who happen to be destroying the planet for profit, yay! This is not an easy sell, but what they can do is try to discredit the left. The people who are concerned with social and economic justice, the people concerned with the environment, the enemy, in other words. They can push a narrative that somehow a group of rainbow-haired SJWs are, on the one hand, totally nuts, unable to deal with any reality or leave their safe spaces for more than 5 minutes, and on the other hand, they are coming for us all. They will take our freedom, or something. And they can keep the left in permanent firefighter mode, dealing with people freaking out over here about trigger warnings and over here about Target bathrooms, those dens of iniquity that house scary transgenders who, don't do anything but go to the bathroom all this time, right? But it doesn't mean that can't be a winning strategy. Now, to do this, they need to go where the kids are, and that means going online. And that means well-produced videos espousing conservative talking points are going to abound. Even if Reason TV, Rebel Media, all these other places go down in flames, there'll be other people right on the way to take their place, right? So what do we have? Well, we have information and the power to spread it. We have the ability to think critically and be skeptical. So please, like, share, and even mirror this video, anybody. Spread it around and keep asking those questions. I'm gonna actually be leaving you with a few thoughts worth hearing from our friends Gad and Christina, and I will be traveling in the next week, so I may not always respond to your post as quickly as I try to, and there won't be a new video till I get back, but no worries. This is Chrisiousity, and you know you liked it, so thumbs up, and you know you want more, so subscribe. Bye!
So everything is viewed through the prism of whether it supports and confirms my ideology or not. So the epistemology is not the one that scientists follow. It's based on adherence to ideology, right?
Right. And that's why it's, as I say, it's almost like a sort of strict religious set of beliefs, and certain things they can accommodate and others they can't. It's not empirical. They begin with this ideology.
Right.
I'm reading Bell Hooks, and there are things I like about her in the book, and then suddenly there'll be, she'll talk about the capitalist, patriarchal, colonialist oppressor, and how we have to bring it down. What is she talking about?
Right.